Welcome everyone to our 6th RPP Forum, the place to come for all things about getting started and working in research practice partnerships. We will hear from educators and researchers around the United States about the successes, challenges, and strategies for overcoming challenges when we get together to solve our most pressing educational problems. It's St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, and we're here for our 6th Forum. Our topic today is sustaining partnerships. And we'll have a conversation about how researchers and practitioners adjust course strategically over time in response to the changing needs of partners and changing circumstances. I'm Bill Penuel from the University of Colorado Boulder School of Education, and I'm facilitating this forum and discussion with support from the Research Practice Collaboratory, a project funded by the National Science Foundation. And I'm excited to welcome our invited panelists who bring a range of background and expertise, as always, in research practice partnerships. You can find this and all future forum conversations archived at bit.ly/RPP Forum. For today's forum, we also invite you to participate on Twitter using the hashtag RPPChat to share ideas that you find interesting and also to pose questions to the panelists. Members of our team will be monitoring Twitter during the forum and will feed us questions from the audience. Of note, this is the final session in this first series of the RPP Forum. Please join us in the fall for our second series. And we'd like to invite you to suggest forum topics for next year by emailing us or by using the RPP chat hashtag on Twitter to tell us your idea. We also want to learn more about who's joining us for these forums. We only have 3 responses so far to our survey. Please let us know who you are by filling out a very short survey at http://tinyurl.com/rppchateval, and we will tweet that URL for you too. So if you have enjoyed these forums, and even if you have not, please let us know by completing a short survey. So to begin today, I want to introduce our participants to you, and I'll do so for everyone so that we have plenty of time to hear from them. So Kara Jackson is, and Kara, if you can wave, is an assistant professor at the University of Washington in mathematics education, whose research focuses on specifying the forms of practice that support all learners to participate in rigorous mathematics and how to reorganize educational contexts to support teachers to develop such forms of practice. And she comes to us from the middle school mathematics and institutional setting of teaching, or MIST project, which has had partnerships with multiple school districts, where they have focused on equity and opportunities to learn math and the coordination of professional learning across different role groups and contexts. Phil Darrow, Phil, raise your hand please, served on the writing team for the Mathematics Common Core State Standards, and he continues to work on implementation and policy issues related to the Common Core. He also works in a partnership with the University of California, Stanford, and others, with the Oakland and San Francisco Unified School Districts for the Strategic Education Research Partnership, or Cerp, with a focus on math and science learning. Patty Kincaid, raise your hand, Patty, is a science coordinator for the Denver Public Schools, whose work focuses primarily now on grant implementation to support the work of DPS science teachers. She networks and partners with informal institutions, community groups, and higher ed institutions. Previously, she served DPS as its secondary science coordinator, and prior to that, she served as a science coordinator and teacher for Cherry Creek School District in Greenwood Village, Colorado, and as an adjunct professor of secondary science methods at the University of Denver's Teacher Ed program. And she is the co-principal investigator of grants that fund the Inquiry Hub partnership composed of DPS, CU Boulder, and the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, where she helps both the research team and district leaders stay closely coordinated with one another. Also from the iHub team and serving as its principal investigator is Tammy Sumner, who is an associate professor at the University of Colorado Boulder with a joint appointment at the Institute of Cognitive Science and Department of Computer Science. She's also the executive director of Digital Learning Sciences, a joint research and development center between CU and the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research. Her research and development team combines expertise in computer science, cognitive science, science education, user-centered design and evaluation, and digital content management, and machine learning, natural language processing. She does it all, folks. And Philip Bell is a professor of learning sciences and human development. He holds the Shauna Larson Chair in Learning Sciences there, and he is also executive director of the University of Washington Institute for Science and Math Education, which is focused on equity-focused innovation in K-12 STEM ed education, and he is co-editor of the Learning in Informal and Formal Environments, co-director, Science of Learning Center, the Life Center, and he pursues a cognitive and cultural program of research across diverse environments focused on how people learn in ways that are personally consequential to them, studying everyday expertise in cognition, argumentation, learning technologies, and culturally expansive science instruction, most recently scaled implementation of educational improvement. And he is a co-director of the Seattle-Renton University of Washington Partnership for Science and Engineering Practices. So welcome to each and all of you. So the way this will work is I'll ask questions in order that you all have seen them, and until the time runs out. And I want to encourage panelists here too to ask questions of each other as we get underway. For the first two questions, we'll go round robin. I will start based on where folks are on my screen, asking them to speak a little bit in response to the question. So with that, we'll get started, and I'll start with Patty here. So, and all of you are part of long-term research practice partnerships. And I'm wondering, Patty, if you could start by telling us a little bit about the work that CU and DPS started doing, and with UCAR involved as well, started doing together as a partnership, and also a little bit about what you're doing now.
Okay, we started back in about 2007 with an NSF grant that we were connecting the National Digital Science Library, Open Educational Resources, DELISI, directly into our district programs for earth science at the middle school and high school level. That's where we started, and it was a fabulous project that really supported teachers in differentiating their instruction. Where we are now is that, again, with NSF funding and some more foundation funding, we are involved in designing a digital high school biology program, and really based in the next generation science standards, and obviously looking at our state standards as well, so that we can support teachers in meeting the needs for state assessments that are based on the state standards as opposed to the whole next generation science standards.
Tammy, you want to add anything about history of our partnership and getting started now?
It really did begin life as a co-design partnership. So DPS had just purchased, made the bold move of going with research-based curriculum in all of their secondary science courses, and they were looking for ways to support teachers in both adopting and adapting those new curriculum materials. And we worked together to create a software tool that supported teachers in both of those tasks. And it began with a 18-month participatory design period with a broad spectrum of earth science teachers, and it just went from there into physical science and then into algebra, and as Patty said, now we're working in biology.
Great. Phil Darrow, tell us a little bit about some of the earliest work that Cerp did with its partners, like who they partnered with and some of the work that you're doing now.
Yeah, Cerp began on the West Coast, where I am, with San Francisco, Berkeley, and Stanford. And San Francisco we're on our third superintendent, with corresponding changes in upper management and even middle management, and have survived very well in the partnership relationship, all those changes. To start with, the district was most interested in STEM wasn't called STEM then, but in mathematics and science. And almost all of our work has either been in mathematics and science or at a higher level, so that encompassed those and other things. The Cerp is kind of a meta partnership. That is, it's not a project. It's a relationship between organizations, the school districts and the universities. And it includes all of the projects that the different institutions might be involved in with those universities. And as time has gone on, I think this is important to the question later about evolution. Coherence has become more a high priority focus of both of the school districts we work with. And with coherence comes pressure on diverse projects to fit into a simpler puzzle that is the school district. And so Cerp is either part of the problem of not fitting with the school district's agenda or part of the solution. And I'm happy to say that we have been major partners in the district's coherence work. And so there is research into coherence, and we've brought that into play. And we've operated a number of projects in mathematics and science, mostly related to a discourse in the mathematics curriculum and discourse in science, problem solving, a number of things. But apart from those individual projects, the partnership has really been at a high level with helping the district make sense of its own work and bringing to bear research, not just from Cerp participants, but from all over, just a general awareness of the various networks and the research community. And I think we've been much more successful bringing research into the district's deliberations than we have with bringing the practitioner concerns out into the research community. And I'll say more about that later.
That's great. Can you just give an example of sort of coherence building work? I'm guessing discourse might be an example of that, but maybe you can make that concrete for us. What does it mean for a partnership to help with coherence?
Yes. So the district wants a theory of action which fits the different pieces together, and each individual silo within the district organization and each project has to rationalize itself with respect to that theory of action. And with the theory of action comes a vocabulary and so on. And part of the move for coherence is when it reaches the teacher and the student, you don't want it to sound like so many different things are happening, and it's the principal's job and the teacher's job to make sense of how they fit together. That work should be done before it gets to the school. So the two principal things I think that we were able to effect, one was an understanding that coherence in one part of the system competes with coherence in another part of the system. And if you make it absolutely coherent at the top, that will create incoherence in the classroom and vice versa. So we got them to understand prioritizing coherence in the classroom first, even if it meant extra work because things were less coherent at the top. And so that was one.
Big insight.
Yeah, it's very important because it really is true that you know, you'd think if you make anything coherent anywhere, it makes it more coherent everywhere. Well, it's the opposite is the truth because there's competitions. The other thing was one of our most important partners, Alan Schoenfeld at UC Berkeley, cognitive scientist working in mathematics, has developed in part through the co-design work and research work with Cerp a consolidation of research into a 5-dimensional model for looking at instruction in mathematics classrooms. And it's really fairly wonderful work. He looked at all the different factors and kind of collapsed them into 5 dimensions. And it's withstood various tests. It's very robust. And so we've introduced that, Cerp has introduced that, and Alan's work into these school districts. And both of the school districts have incorporated, it's called True Math, Trumath, and you can Google it and find out all about it. Very handy, very insightful. And so he introduced that. So the theory of action, at the center of the theory of action in both school districts, are the 5 dimensions of true math. In San Francisco's case, they took 3 of those dimensions and made them the central feature of their theory of action, and put the 2 others were subordinated to those 3. But it's helped, and it crosses mathematics into other subjects. So all of the disciplines agreed to those 5 dimensions. So this affects how the district helps principals know what to look for when they walk into a classroom, how the district kind of looks at the PD plans to see what dimensions the PD is, they anticipate creating improvement, if any. And it's really clarified the vision at all the different levels by making it coherent, make it easier for people to talk to.
That sounds interesting. Now, Kara, this resonates, I think, a lot with what the MIST team set out to do from the very start. Could you tell us a little bit about where MIST started and where it is today, and maybe add in a little bit about the role of a theory of action of instructional improvement at scale, because I know that's central for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So MIST started in 2007. It was housed at Vanderbilt University, and the original principal investigators were Paul Cobb in math education and Tom Smith, who's on leadership, policy, and organization. And I think that's important, and that it was trying to bridge both what we know about classroom learning and teaching from math ed and learning sciences, but also what do we know about leadership and policy from that field. So the goal of the work was to try to understand what does it take to improve the quality of mathematics teaching and learning in middle school classrooms at the scale of large urban districts. And so it was funded from National Science Foundation. So initially that was the research goal, was to figure out what does it take to improve its scale. And as part of that then, we recruited 4 large urban districts, all of whom were attempting really ambitious work at the middle grades math level. And this was in 2007, so it's at the height of No Child Left Behind, and I think they're pretty remarkable in that even though the state assessments to which they were being held accountable were not as rigorous as one might like, they were aiming higher than that. And so they had adopted reform-oriented curricula, namely Connected Mathematics Project 2 in 3 of the 4 districts, had a variety of coherent sets of supports for teachers, coaches, and school leaders. So in the first 4 years, that was sort of phase 1 of the work. Briefly, there was both a research agenda, but then there was also a pragmatic element to this that I think is probably common to all of our research practice partnerships. Pragmatically, what we were trying to do was really add value to the district's effort. So each fall, we would talk with district leaders in each of the 4 districts and identify what was their theory of action for improving instruction at scale. What were their strategies they were designing? And then we'd collect data throughout the year on how it is that those strategies are playing out. And then we would provide feedback back to the district leaders around, here are your strategies, here's how it's playing out, here's why it might not be playing out as intended, and then make recommendations for how to improve it the following year. That was the pragmatic part of the project, or the part that I think really added value to the district's efforts. From a research perspective then, we stepped back from that annual cycle work each year and tried to look across the 4 districts as cases of districts engaging in this kind of ambitious work and generate an empirically grounded theory of action for instructional improvement at the scale of large urban districts. So a more generalizable theory of action that could then, other districts might be able to apply in their own work. That was the first 4 years, that was with 4 districts. And then the second 4 years, so 2011 until just this past year, we worked with 2 of the original 4, and we engaged in much, I would say, a more collaborative work around co-designing and co-leading efforts to improve the quality of professional learning and to coordinate professional learning across various role groups like teachers, coaches, principals. And then currently this year we're working with 1 of those original 4 districts and actually collaborating with Phil and others at Cerp in San Francisco Unified School District to work on helping district leaders and coaches, school leaders, teachers act on an even more rapid basis by figuring out what's happening with the quality of discourse in their classrooms. So we've been working to design a set of practical measures around the quality of discourse in classrooms, and then figuring out what are the routines and the data representations around that could help both teachers act on their, Phil's giving the Me Too sign, help teachers act rapidly to improve their practice, but also help people like coaches, school leaders, district leaders say what's happening across a broad swath of classrooms that could then inform how it is you target limited resources.
And can you tell everyone what's a practical measure and how does it support this improvement work you're talking about?
Yeah, so practical measures, we've been drawing on the work of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, their improvement science line of work. So practical measures, in contrast to research measures or accountability measures, are designed to be easy to implement, quick to analyze, and to give you information that's actionable in a very rapid cycle. So in our case, for example, again, with the folks at Cerp and San Francisco Unified School District, we know the quality of discourse in classrooms really matters for kids learning. And so we've been trying to develop quick student surveys that can be done in less than 3 minutes that a class can take. And from that, you could then see were kids being pressed to explain their thinking, were they being asked to engage in the kind of discourse we know matters for kids learning, and with an eye towards having items that would then help point you to what are the next steps you might take to improve the quality of that teaching.
Great. Phil, tell us a little bit about the origins of your partnership, the work that you were doing at the beginning, and maybe what you're doing now.
Sure. So our particular partnership, it is a kind of a multi-project driven partnership. So we kind of secure soft money grants, either implementation grants or research grants, and like try to piece together our program of action to keep the work progressing over the long haul. So that's kind of the context, and we've been funded through Department of Ed, Math Science Partnerships, and through the National Science Foundation to do this. We are trying to implement the educational vision that's laid out in the NRC framework and the Next Gen Science Standards, so that's the focus. We're so it's the University of Washington Institute for Science and Math Ed, Seattle Public Schools, Renton School District, and the Institute for Systems Biology. Those are the partners, and we together work with about 100 teachers per year through a curriculum adaptation strategy. So instructional materials not existing and realizing there's no money within the system anyway for new materials at this moment, given curriculum adoption cycles. And so can we actually use an adaptation approach to the existing instructional materials as a space for professional learning and resource building for the districts in that way? And so we have about 15 people on the partnership team working with those 100 teachers, just to give you an image of it. The early work, we had 70 elementary school teachers out of 1,100 from Seattle Public Schools involved in that work, and we had all the middle school science teachers from Renton, which were about 25. And the focus there was really around a few of the practices, the science and engineering practices that are in the new vision, and to go deep in explanation, argumentation, and engineering design, just to kind of start to give a core focus to the work, and then ripple that out more broadly over years. Currently, we're in our second phase of funding. We've shifted to now be working with all middle school science teachers in Seattle, so about 75 teachers, and then we will be working with all Renton High School science teachers, but kind of one discipline at a time. So we're working with all the chemistry teachers this year, biology next year, physics the year after that. And we've shifted, because the standards are different at middle school and high school, to be much more focused on the modeling practice. So we have a much deeper focus on bringing teachers and students into modeling focused instruction in the 3D learning approach that's laid out in the vision. And we're adding some new lines of work on top of that that just kind of match onto that. So we have a 3D formative assessment design effort within the broader partnership. So we have a working group that does that work and try to bring all the teachers into building capacity to do assessment design that fits their instructional context. And then also we're leveraging discourse strategy tools to kind of work directly on culturally and linguistically diverse students, and kind of built a partnership out within the Seattle district with the staff who do that work broadly across the district to kind of tighten up the coordination across those parts of the district activities.
And Phil, maybe I can ask you to speak a little bit to coherence, because I know you work really closely with leaders in curriculum instruction. What is it? How is it that this coheres as a set of strategies that organize the lines of work that you're undertaking to support NGSS implementation in Seattle and Renton?
Yeah, I mean, just to build on what Phil Darrow was saying, like the classroom level learning experience is kind of where we're kind of centered to try to figure out how to bring coherence, and as Kara was sharing too, like how do you get that kind of what we know to be a productive set of learning processes to happen within the classroom instruction space, and that for us, because we are an instructional materials adaptation project, we're trying to figure out like how best to be scaffolding teachers into kind of implementing aspects of the new vision, like engaging kids in sense making and argumentation and building conceptual models and refining those through kind of an effort to kind of shift the existing materials. And in some ways it's pretty straightforward and you can kind of make particular shifts. In other ways, the existing materials are so far removed from the vision that it's a pretty heavy lift to kind of bring them into a more coherent space. And it's an ongoing effort. The luxury of being kind of project funded for a few years at a time in each of these efforts is that we get to iterate on those materials and kind of keep improving them. So small groups of teachers run in different directions to do those adaptations, and then they iterate on them over time. And then 2 or 3 years in, we stop and we look at the whole collection of adaptations and start to piece together kind of more coherent sequences across. And so that's feeding now into the discussion of the district around the scope and sequence work that they're doing around the next gen science standards, now that things are to that stage of kind of the implementation within the district.
Great, thanks. So now I want to turn and invite these partnerships that are represented here, since this is really about evolution. These are long-standing partnerships that have undergone different phases. And the way I want to frame this question is partnerships go through these phases. They have ebbs and flows. The thing about these is chapters in a book, and if you could give a name to those chapters, what would that name be, and what sort of distinguishes each phase from one another, and maybe what brought it about. So we'll start with Patty, and then I'll let Tammy, we'll do an inter-rater reliability check on the iHub story to see if there are different phases from the practice versus the research side. So Patty, you want to start?
Sure. Chapter 1 is iHub, or Curriculum Customization Service, sorry. And again, that was when we were supporting our district program with global resources. And that was hugely successful, and Tammy can support that through the research in terms of teacher usage and impact on student learning. It was a real positive experience for both the research side and the practitioner side. Chapter 2 would go into our work with Algebra 1 teachers. There we took the existing Discovering Algebra program, linked it to Common Core State Standards, found gaps, overlaps, places where teachers needed additional support, and vetted problems. And that too was a successful program, though not of the magnitude of impact as Curriculum Customization Service had. Our third chapter would be the iHub project, where we've used next generation science standards, the DCIs, in designing a digital program using open educational resources and designing. We started with the ecology, going then into evolution, and we've piloted twice with the original ecology unit, and we've just piloted the evolution unit with about 10 or 11 teachers, but about 1,000 students. Feedback has been great from the practitioner perspective and the student perspective. We're now embarking on the designing of the heredity chapter. Tammy.
Patty,
chapter.
that's exactly how I would have described the chapter. So either it's a good thing or we've been working together too long. But no, it's exactly how I would have described the chapters. And I would add, perhaps because our partnership is focused on a single district, that we've really been driven by the priorities within the district. So we as the research team didn't show up and say, gee, I think you need this software tool that'll help you customize your curriculum. DPS was heading down this path, and they were trying to do it with lots of sheets of paper and big white binders that were stacked all over the hallways in the central district office. And they basically approached us and said, we need to do this in a more interactive, more dynamic way. And again, when we started working on algebra, it wasn't that the research team said, gee, I think you need some algebra help. It came from the curriculum and instruction leadership, said this is our priority for the coming couple of years. Can we work together on this? And that's exactly how we ended up working in biology. It was the district realized that we were up against an aging curriculum and the introduction of the next generation science standards, and circumstances came together to say this is our new district priority. And so we had we were lucky that we could be flexible, and we had the right kind of funding that allowed us to be flexible, and also that it wasn't like the district was presenting us with a new priority every year or something. These were all multi-year efforts and initiatives, so there was nice continuity in each of these.
That's great. Phil Darrow, tell us a little bit about how you would divide the chapters of Cerp history.
Well, the first chapter is the kind of quid pro quo process of what to expect from the partnership on both sides. What can researchers expect from the school district and vice versa? And accepting the idea, our first principle is that the practitioners decide the priorities. And we don't allow researchers to translate the district's priorities into research terminology. They have to accept the way the district puts it. And that just getting to the point where we learn what to expect from each other. The second phase was coming to grips with the nature of a school district. It's one thing to help a district office perform its ordinary functions. It's another thing to try to accomplish goals in a school district, which includes the students, that school districts historically have found very difficult to accomplish. And they're very difficult for school districts to accomplish because of the structural nature of what a school district is, how it's organized, and how thin the resources are at critical points. So our school districts both made their highest priority for our work changing instructional practice in the classroom, and particularly elevating the cognitive demand of day-to-day work that students did, making it more equitable, using terminology now that we have from True Math, increasing the agency of students in their own learning and in classroom processes, etc. And then we had to learn and reckon with the very weak connection between the school district office and the classroom. We'd like to think once a district knows what it wants and forms its resolve and determination, has built its political capital, it's just a matter of, quote, implementation, unquote. before it reaches the classroom. Well, we more or less discovered the word implementation really refers to a category of hallucinations. It's not, it doesn't describe anything in the real world. And in our districts, this normal condition was compounded by quite a bit of a culture of school autonomy, and within schools, a fair amount of teacher autonomy as well. So that was the culture. So we would work with the school district curriculum and instruction leaders and so on, come up with wonderful things that we were all enthusiastic about, trial them with the volunteer teachers, and then we don't hit a stone wall. What we hit is a very tall sand dune in a windstorm. Getting scale across other teachers, the district does not have the resources to do that. It doesn't have time contact with teachers. It doesn't have personnel in a sufficient dosage and density, all of those things. So we had to, when you reckon with that, then you have to develop strategies that take all of that into account. And I think one of the, I guess I would put in the stage where we're in now. Meanwhile, while you're doing this, you come across the ordinary work of districts where you can be quite helpful. So we were able to help the district put performance assessments into its interim assessment, into its periodic assessments. So it wasn't just multiple choice. We were able to, an example I'll show in a few minutes, help them formulate very powerful policies for course pathways in mathematics. And we're able to do a number of things like that. But I'm speaking now of the highest priority, which is changing practice in the classroom. We run into a fundamental reality of a district. What I call the command structure, which is the students report to the teacher reports to the principal reports to the deputy superintendent of principals, and that reports to the superintendent, to the school board, who reports to the parents, who report to the kids. So that command structure is a world of urgencies. The majority of things that principals work on any given day were things that didn't exist while they were driving to work. So the idea that a principal plans their day, it's a joke. They plan their day and they have an agenda and so on, but most of the things on their agenda are breathers from their real work, which is dealing with all the things that came up that day. So it's not an exaggeration to say it's a world of urgencies. On the other hand, the curriculum office is a world of dreams. Their job is to develop the vision for what good instruction looks like, to develop the vision of what the curriculum is. Their time scale is, realistically, it's really 5 or 10 years, but they never get that long. So they're supposed to do 5 and 10 years worth of work in 2 or 3 years. That's a real different time scale than the urgency of the principal lives in. And so to get things from a center into classrooms, you have to pass through this world of urgency. Translating the dreams into urgencies or into form that will live in a world of urgencies is kind of a design challenge that's really a wonderful challenge, but it's not, there's nothing easy about it because it's inherently full of contradictions. In both of these worlds, urgency and dreams are necessary. The world of dreams is the only reason we have schools in the first place. That's what schools are for. They're not there for the urgencies. But on the other hand, the urgencies cannot be ignored. You have to deal with them. How do you get these two different worlds to function together?
That's really the core work of the partnerships. So, Phil, you have a career, I think, as a novelist who could write these things as chapters. You've got the poetry with this partnership work. Kara, tell us a little bit about, how would you divide the chapters of MIST? And I know you have multiple partnerships, so maybe frame this in terms of how you want to describe it as the MIST as a whole or with a particular district. So.
Yeah, and when thinking about this too, I'm conscious this is from a researcher's perspective, so I'd be very curious from our partner practitioners to see how they would divide it up. But from where I sat, I think of chapter 1, and maybe it should be chapter 0, is that it was about researchers establishing credibility. So the very first year, we very much had to prove to the district leaders, in particular at the central office, that this project was going to be worth people's time. And we had to indicate how it is that we were going to add value to the district instructional improvement efforts. So, and that was very much on, at least on the research team's mind, I'm sure, and we've since had conversations with folks like chief academic officers, and that was very much on their minds too. So given that the work was designed to carry out over annual cycles, it was kind of by the end of that first year when we had a feedback and recommendations meeting in each of the 4 districts with the district leaders presenting back findings and recommendations about how their strategies had played out. It was very much like if these weren't specific enough, if these weren't actionable enough, the recommendations and so forth, then probably the partnership wasn't going to continue. So I think of that first year as just establishing really the credibility and the viability of the partnership in terms of what it could add value to for the districts. Making it over that hump, then I feel like the next year, knowing that we had established some workable routines and it seemed to be that what was being provided back to the districts was of use, it feels to me like then the next 3 years or so were very much about working with the district leaders to think about how do you improve the design of instructional improvement strategies, and that I think was informed by the way in which we had kind of constructed these annual cycles where the feedback really came at the end of the year and then you had an opportunity to think about what you would do differently for the following year. But there wasn't much opportunity to think about these things were actually playing out, say in January, what might I do differently with respect to any specific strategy around coaching, around professional development, et cetera. And I think that then sort of led to what I would think of as the chapter 3, which was a much more focused on how do you improve the way in which the particular strategies are being implemented during the year. And for the next 4 years then, it required that we engaged in much more ongoing collaborative work with the district leaders. In particular, where we kind of carved a niche out was to say, let's work together to try to co-design and co-lead some professional learning to see what might be possible if we coordinated a little bit more work between leadership and curriculum and instruction in particular. And then I think that maybe we're still in that phase. It's just taken a slightly different turn, but where it's like even that it felt like we were working with a small number of people on a more ongoing basis in a more collaborative manner, but realizing the challenge of, I think Phil was talking about this earlier, the need to be able to pilot things on a much smaller basis rather than trying to engage in some design work that's going to roll out at scale across the whole district at once. And so the current chapter is about and again, here taking the lead a lot from the Carnegie folks, figuring out what they would say, how do you learn your way to scale? So how do you be really intentional about starting small, piloting, working out kinks, and also attending to variation and context, and then kind of thinking about scaling along those lines. And so that's where we are at the moment, I would say.
Great. Phil, tell us a little bit about the chapters of your partnership.
Sure, I found this to be a fun little exercise, yeah. But I'm not nearly as poetic as others. It's like, so chapter 1 for us was assemble and sprint. This was early on in the NGSS days. We had not adopted the standards of the state when we started our partnership work to actually support the implementation of them. So we were using the framework and the standards as they were, hoping that things would get adopted, which they did. And so we were using kind of the best teacher-facing materials and approaches that existed at that moment in time to kind of build out the first year of work, and we kind of hired a lead PD designer of one with feedback from others to really kind of help us kind of get through that summer week-long launch and into the year. So that we're, and people were transitioning from other projects and onto this one, and we're figuring out how to get our routines together and what the work would look like. And so there was a lot of early transition startup work. Chapter 2, a year later, I would say I would frame as NGSS 201. So we had, teachers, district staff, and researchers are all on their multi-year learning pathways around the work. We're all figuring out how to do this, new vision out in real spaces. And so we were getting better at understanding what those particular issues are that we wanted to focus on. Graduate students in particular were out collaborating in a co-design stance kind of like way with teachers and doing field work on what's happening in classrooms. So we started seeing particular problems of practice come up. So around engineering design, kids getting very frustrated at kind of in many places and trying to figure out like what happens when your design fails and how do we build different classroom cultures that kind of reframe failure in that specific way. And that's one of many that we were kind of seeing happen. So the second year, the 201 courses were like we have the luxury of working with people to get 2 or 3 years into implementing the new vision, right? So it's really the same cadre of teachers, sinking in through the professional learning experiences, but also in their classrooms and through the ongoing work into the work. There's an interlude at the end of the first project where it's like, I remember my partner Dan Gallagher said, "Oh, the teachers that have been in our effort for 3 years just described our model back to us." So it basically was like a check-in with them to say, "How did this go for you? How can we get better at what we're doing?" And they talked about how it leveraged their expertise as practitioners to focus implementation work, but also supported them to learn new things in safe ways, like in a very respectful, genuine way. The work was focused on real things that mattered to them around what they do in their classrooms with their kids, around the materials, around rubrics, around different things. It helped build cross-building relationships that they deeply appreciated, that they don't necessarily get much time to do because we kept the same small groups together for 3 years. So they really developed working relationships across the district in new ways. And so it was a good, nice interlude. Chapter 3 right now, I would say we're breaking a lot of new ground together. So we kind of have distributed co-design of all the professional learning experiences, and like we're doing that together. We're actually building out kind of supports for teachers in between the release days and the Summer Institute to try to keep the work going in a number of different ways. We have just a growing capacity to take on new work around formative assessment, around ELL strategies, around supports for modeling-centered instruction. So it really is kind of a new larger endeavor with a lot of new co-design and iterative improvement.
It's great. These stories sound wonderful and developmental and moving forward, but I know all of you and your partnerships. I certainly know ours, and sometimes you get thrown for a loop, and I think there's time for one or two of us to share. In what ways have you evolved your partnership after getting thrown for a loop or getting thrown off course? I don't think all of this evolution has happened simply because this made sense or this was in the original grant proposal to do. Would somebody be willing to share a little bit of how you've evolved in order to stay viable and alive when you were, maybe thrown for a loop and thrown off course?
Well, I don't know that we were thrown off course, but certainly when we wrote our grant proposal, we didn't talk about designing an NGSS biology curriculum. First, the NGSS hadn't been released, and we had proposed to do what we had been doing, which is do some adaptations. And then between when we wrote the grant and we got the money and the work started, there was just seismic shifts in what was taking place in the environment, both at DPS and with the advent of the NGSS. And so we were lucky that we had the flexibility to just completely pivot and change what we were doing.
Phil Darrow, you have if you want to add? Yeah.
We did some work in mathematics on helping students make sense of word problems. I think some very important work, and it was designed to fit the infrastructure of the school district for getting stuff into the classrooms through a teacher leadership organization. And they had funded this district structure of teacher leaders, and they had time and PLC, all that stuff. With a change in superintendent and a reorganization of the district, that entire infrastructure was erased. And the new philosophy was the resources should go out to the schools. So the funding that used to support a centralized infrastructure was distributed to schools who then had to, and this is a natural rhythm, and people who've been at it for a while know districts go back and forth. between centralized, decentralized, and there's various reasons why. But when that happened, a lot of the people who had developed deep expertise in the work we had done in the school district got dispersed, and the range of their influence was much more limited, and the range of their responsibility inside of schools was expanded tremendously. So they not only didn't they have the time to use the expertise in the smaller zone of just a school, but they had the smaller zone of influence. So I think we lost a lot, and since then we've been trying to be more robust and not so dependent on any existing structure. And I think that's worked better, although it's a little more frustrating and less definite.
Phil, if there were a sacred text on research practice partnerships, that would be a canonical story in such a text. I think all of us would agree.
Everyone goes through that.
Everyone goes through this. This is one of those texts. Kara, you wanted to add a final comment before we go to resource sharing.
Yes, I would just say ditto. Yes, those sorts of things have certainly come up in our project and have caused, we've taken different turns. But the thing I wanted to add was that I think also in terms of evolution of a partnership, there's evolution in the problems of practice that in our case, and mostly we were working with district leaders face, but there's also evolution in the research questions that kind of arise from the work that sometimes take you in new directions. I certainly think where we are now we wouldn't have predicted several years ago, and part of because of developments in the field and learning from other people engaged in this kind of work, and also in our case over time continually trying to refine and test conjectures that are explicit in the theory of action we've been generating lead us to want to pursue different sorts of questions. And then it's sort of a negotiation with districts figuring out what is the problem of practice that you're bringing to the table, and how is it that does this fit or not with sort of the kind of questions that are arising in the context of the research.
That's great. I think we could have a whole nother session on this topic of strategic evolution because we've just scratched the surface. But I want us to move on, and each of these folks have shared a resource, and I want to give them a little chance to talk about a resource that will be available on the RPC website. And we make this very open-ended for everybody to be able to share something with us, and we will tweet these resources out so you can know where to find them. So, Patty, you want to tell us a little bit about the resource from iHub? I think it's a good example of one of these practical measures, eh?
Yes, it's the student self-assessment that we are using as part of our design of the biology curriculum. And what is so significant about this from the practitioner side, but I think also the researcher side, is that we talk a lot about student-led learning environments. This is truly an opportunity for students to have a voice in their learning. And what we have found from using this tool is that we get some tremendous insight into the effectiveness of the instructional strategies and the instructor themselves from the student perspective, and that we may think that the instruction is as a high quality, but from the student feedback we're learning that we're having to really shift instructional practices from a more traditional approach to a more inquiry and practice-based approach, because we're hearing from the students what they're getting and how they feel about their learning. So they're really telling us how they're feeling as learners. So it's really been a valuable tool.
Great. Phil Darrow, tell us about the resources that you've shared today.
There are two. One I won't talk about because reading works pretty well. That's the Pathways Through Math courses work we did. We brought San Francisco and Oakland together, and they did that work together and separately went to their school boards, and both succeeded. I think in large part because of the preparation work, what we wrote, the Cerp plus the two districts. And we'll be speaking about this at NCTM if anyone's there. But both boards did adopt kind of fairly revolutionary course pathway sequences. And it was based on research, surprising research that revealed that in virtually all school districts and all states, even though people believe the contrary because they look at cohort data, when you look at transcript data, there are usually 30 or 40 different pathways that students go through that have 2 or 3 or 4% of the population in them. And this was the surprise, there is no pathway that has as many as 10% of the kids in it. And so something's really broken about why kids go through what pathways. But just quickly, the other tool we came up with, the 5x8 card, which you can find along with the pathways work on the Cerp Institute website. When we worked with principals, because when we understood the command structure, we went directly to the principals organization and we got access to a series of workshops with principals. And they wanted, their question was, what should we look for in math classrooms for the Common Core? And when we brought the practices to them, because you can't expect mathematics content expertise from principals, we decided to center it on the mathematical practices. They found the practices fairly useless. They weren't concrete enough, they were too sweeping, and so on. We went to the Stanford Design School, some people there work with us, and they told us we had to do detailed empathy work, not needs assessments, when you do design work. And you have to look at it from the user perspective. When we did that work, the #1 finding from principals was, don't make us read anything. And one principal put it, all through our careers, people send us binders of useless truths, and we don't read them. And so we called our project the 5x8 card project for that reason. And we came up with 8 catalytic things that principals could see. And by catalytic, we meant they were not comprehensive. We didn't try to cover everything. We wanted sharp, pointy, vivid things, not comprehensive things. And so the first one was, students say a second sentence. So when a student is called on and says something, the teacher follows up and the students say a second sentence. And the second one was, students talk about each other's ideas, not just their own. And so it's that sort of thing. These are catalytic. Principals could see them, they understood them. They had huge face validity. When the principals tried it, they found the second sentence predicted 100% who the good teachers were, that based on who they knew the best teachers were.
That's great. So, Phil, I want to go on to Kara because we just have a couple minutes left, and then to Phil Bell.
Okay. So the resource that I shared to be posted was Tony Brike, Louis Gomez, Alicia Gurno, and Paula Mayhew's book that recently came out, Learning to Improve How America's Schools Can Get Better at Getting Better, in which they really put forth what they've learned from engaging in the improvement science efforts housed at Carnegie, and that has just been really helpful in thinking through this next phase of work that we've been involved in trying to engage, collaborate with practitioners to figure out ways to figure out if, one, like what might be useful changes to try to make that would move towards improvement, and how is it that you know if any changes you're making are moving towards improvement, and then also ideas on how to think about being really principled and deliberate about quote-unquote learning your way to scale.
Cool. So we have a strategy within kind of our project to write articles to try to describe different dimensions of the work. So we just posted one this morning on the researchingpractice.org website, which you'll get a link to, called Working in the Near and Long Term. And I'm a designer, like, by history, and so I'm a learning scientist, so I think in design principles. So I kind of put a little bit, and so I put some operating principles into that particular piece. And so just to kind of tease you with the ideas, evolve the partnership work to build capacity for the long haul while staying fundable in the near term. This is the first one. I think it's straightforward. Second one, attend to the broad range of priorities at your partner institutions, integrating relevant initiatives into the team's work as possible. Third one, celebrate successes, socialize, 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 proactively manage uncertainties, anxieties, and conflicts that arise, and because it's complicated work with people who come from different places and different ways of talking and working. And the last one, shift and define work roles and activities to manage personnel changes and to meet new needs or desires while building capacity across the teams. So I'll just leave it there, and let us know if you have ideas for how to improve the kinds of descriptions we're producing about our partnership work.
And what a great way to synthesize some of the wisdom that we've heard today from our people who've been involved in long-standing partnerships and had to evolve them over time. I hope everyone will join me in thanking the panelists today. And you can continue this conversation on Twitter using the hashtag RPPchat. And you can find all of the resources mentioned today on the Research Practice Collaboratory website at researchandpractice.org. Research and Practice is all one word. You can also follow the Research and Practice Collaboratory on Twitter at RP Collaboratory, RPC Laboratory. The Research and Practice Collaboratory is funded by the National Science Foundation, and all views are those of our panelists and not of our funder. Please join us in the fall for our second series. We want you to suggest some topics for us for the series through RPP Chat. And before you go, please remember to tell us more about you, our viewers, by completing a very short survey at http://tinyurl.com/RPPChatEval. That's tinyurl.com/RPPChatEval. And that's it for the 6th Research Practice Partnership Forum, where we are researchers and educators working together for a better, more equitable education system for all our nation's young people. Thanks for joining today.